Let's return now to the energy debate. A few different issues at the moment. There's the wash-up of the nuclear policy from the coalition. Also comments from the chair of the National Energy Regulator. I want to get some thoughts with Program Director of Energy and Climate Change at the Grattan Institute, Tony Wood. Tony, great to see you. So let's start with the comments made by the chairwoman of the Australian Energy Regulator, Claire Savage. She's talking about the issue around the concentration of traditional power supply dominating the price structure, even though renewables have been increasing their presence in the energy grid. How does this work and how can that be overcome?
Well, for probably the last 25 years or more, we've had concerns about the concentration of power in the electricity system, in the power system. And most of it arises when you get a couple of large generators dominating one state, and when the interconnector with the next door state is broken down or something, then they have enormous market power in that state. What happens with renewables is they tend to behave very differently from coal and gas. That is, they're there when the sun's shining and the wind is blowing, and they're not when they're not. So that means that at times you've got a huge amount of solar, particularly on rooftops, flooding into the system. That means prices go down and there's lots of competition. Other times when we have a limit on how much solar we can have, like at night time and so on, you can get a concentration of power because the only people who can compete in the market is a small number of big generators. That's what this is about. It also highlights why a major review that's only been announced by the Commonwealth Government very recently, Kieran, is going to look at a fundamental structure of the electricity market. And one of the issues it'll have to deal with is this question of how do we provide incentives for new investment, but how do we also make sure that that new investment doesn't itself lead to or create concentration of market power, which can be exercised with real consequences.
And when you've got, so fundamentally the price structure is set by the highest input at any given time on the spot price market. Basically, coal and gas is often still setting the price of electricity. That's a major issue right now, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's like going to an auction in a way, in that all the companies, all the generators in Sydney or Melbourne or wherever, they bid to supply electricity tomorrow for every 5 minutes. Every 5 minutes. And the market operator says, okay, we'll start with the cheapest and we'll just fill up the bucket for how much energy we need, electricity we need at that point in time. Now, whatever the final, so the price is going up and the bucket's getting filled. As you get to the full bucket, it's the price of the last bit that sets the market price. Now, if there's huge amounts of, say, renewables flooding into the system, or even coal when it's actually quite cheap, that's fine, you get low prices. But on the other hand, if you haven't got too much competing, then what you tend to get, of course, the last bit of the bucket gets filled up with the most expensive. And if that gives someone power to do it because there's nobody else who can fill that last bit of the bucket, that's when you have the problem that the regulator is concerned about. There are things that can be done about this. They're not simple, but the regulator's highlighting this is something we need to address. Otherwise, we will have problems down the track a bit.
Yeah, well, that's going to be interesting to see how they do overcome that issue and the volatility, the unpredictability of renewables at this stage as storage is still coming online. You've had a few days now to look at the nuclear proposal. What's your overall take now as we sit here just ahead of Christmas?
Look, I don't have a problem fundamentally with nuclear power on the idea of is it dangerous, is it horrible, whatever. I think the economics are very challenging. And what the opposition is proposing is a small number, 7 nuclear power stations to be built after 2035. To do that, they've got to keep coal open a bit longer, and they've also got to make sure that it's there ready, it's still there when the nuclear arrives. So that leads to some very significant fundamental risks. The economics of the way they've compared the two scenarios, nuclear or not nuclear, the way the numbers have been done, it's a bit like comparing, well, I'm going to compare driving an electric vehicle from Melbourne to the Gold Coast and driving a petrol car from Melbourne to Sydney. Not surprisingly, the two are not comparable because we're not doing the same thing. And so that's one thing I have found problematic with the numbers that were published by the opposition this time last week. In addition to that, I think the proposal exposes some very significant risks, Kieran, that I think we need to better understand before we would embrace this proposition. So, for example, can we really build that much infrastructure in that time frame at the cost that's being proposed? Our experience is that would be very challenging. So at the very least, there are some very big questions about not so much can it be done, but what are the risks we're exposing our system to? And my view is that they haven't yet established, in my opinion, a case for going from where we are now on a pathway to high renewables with gas, and maybe even in the future small modular nuclear reactors, going to saying we're going to go and start the pathway to nuclear now and slow down the move towards renewables and try and keep coal operating. That seems to me to be far more challenging. I think to convince me, and to be honest, the broader voting public who will have the choice, I think they've still got some ways to go, because I think the risks at the moment outweigh the possible benefits.
Can you have nuclear alongside renewables in the way that they're proposing? Because one of the arguments the government's making is that it will crowd out and have to reduce the share of, say, rooftop solar, for example.
What happens now, Kieran, is we've got about 46% of our electricity comes from coal and about 40% comes from renewables. And what happens, particularly in the middle of the day, as we were talking about before with the concentration of market power, when the renewables are flooding into the system, as they do because the sun's shining and the electricity is being produced, or the wind is blowing, that crowds out, dramatically reduces prices in the middle of the day and crowds out the coal-fired power stations. What the opposition and the modelling hasn't shown is, well, why wouldn't the same thing happen when you've got nuclear at 54% of, 38% of the system and renewables at 54%, about the same as what we've got now, except today it's renewables and coal. In the future, it will be renewables and nuclear. Now, it means that when you do get those circumstances in the middle of the day, something has to give. Either the nuclear doesn't run, therefore you will not get the level of occupancy that has been modelled by the opposition and by frontier economics. And if you do, the cost will be, if you get lower occupancy because the nuclear gets turned down, then of course the cost of the nuclear goes up dramatically. On the other hand, the alternative, which is what the government's saying is, well, if you're going to force the nuclear to run all the time, something else has to give, namely the renewables. What's going to happen to that electricity that's being produced on your roof by your solar system to power your house?
Yes, indeed. So implications for the household solar boom, which shows no sign of abating just yet. Tony Wood, we appreciate your insights as always. Thank you so much for today, but throughout the year as well. We'll catch you next year.
Thank you very much.